This is the Marketing Podcast Network.
Welcome to Uncorking a Story, the podcast that introduces you to the rich world of storytellers who share their personal journeys, creative processes, and the stories behind their stories, one conversation at a time. I'm your host, Mike Carlon, and I'm thrilled to be part of your writing journey. If you're an aspiring writer, a literary enthusiast, or simply someone who believes in the transformative power of words, you've come to the right place. Every week, we'll pop the cork on the world of successful storytellers and give you a healthy pour of inspiration, insight, and empowerment. My mission is to help writers like you realize your full potential through the transformative and therapeutic power of writing. Whether you're just starting your literary voyage or looking to refine your craft, I'm here to provide you with the knowledge, inspiration, and encouragement you need to embark on your own storytelling adventure. So, are you ready to uncork your story and let your creativity flow? Uncorking a Story is about to begin. Sit back, relax, and let the transformative magic of storytelling whisk you away. Welcome to Uncorking a Story. Jude Berman grew up amid floor-to-ceiling shelves of books in many languages. In addition to a love of literature, her refugee parents instilled in her a deep appreciation for cultural diversity and social justice. She joins me today on Uncorking a Story to talk about her background and recent award-winning novel, The Die. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Jude.
Hi, to be with you.
Nice to have you here, Jude. I'm curious, where does your story as an author begin?
Yeah, so my story as an author in a lot of ways begins on the other side of the aisle, so to speak. I've been had many decades of work as a professional editor, and actually also even at one point ran a small publishing company. So I worked with books, but they were always other people's books. They were largely nonfiction, although some fiction would creep in there, but most of the people who have a budget, for editing on their own are writing nonfictions. And plus I had, content knowledge for that as well. So that's where it started, was this sense that I was working for so long on people's books. A lot of them were good. Some of them, I could have done without, but I started to feel like, why not why not me? What could, why am I not writing my own books? And in fact, I actually was writing my own books during a lot of that time. But I wasn't following through. I wasn't becoming an author. I was more like a writer at that point, and not an author. And so that at some point gradually, started to change and flip over to where I, came, I can do this. And in fact, I am going to do this. I'm going to pursue it. And I did pursue it. It's not an easy thing to get published. It was an easy thing many years ago. And when I first tried, I think it would have been quite easy because you could just sort of contact a publisher directly, even without an agent. And and we've gone through decades to where that has become completely, almost, well, unless you're going to a very small press with nonfiction or something, that, you're unlikely to be able to do that now. So for someone at my age, I recognized how difficult that was to get a publisher. But I pursued it and found a solution that, is working for me, which is actually a hybrid publisher. And I know it's not for everybody, but it's working out really well. It's a model that I really respect. I actually think is the future of publishing.
So where were you in your life when you published your first book? So when you went from that transition from, publishing other people's books to having your own out there?
Yeah. Well, okay. So maybe I was oversimplifying a little bit. So I actually did publish some books of nonfiction way back, decades ago. So if you look on my Goodreads, you'll see, half a dozen books or whatever. And some of them, well, I mean, books aren't really out of print anymore. Some of them are, but so I was doing some of that, but the distinction, I think, is the books that I really wanted, that I really cared about, that I really wanted to write. And that's actually just happened this year.
All right. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah. Yeah. So I have two books, one that already came out this year and one that's coming out next week. They're totally different. One's about the future and one's about the past. And the future was before the past in the terms of which book came out first. So The Die is the book that came out first in April. And that book is actually a book I think I'm going back to the sense of a long timeline here. That book actually was a sort of twinkle in my eye about 20 years ago when I had the idea, the sort of core idea, wanted to take stories that I had studied and practiced in my life that came from the Eastern tradition. You may have heard of, and although it's not that well known in the West, the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, those stories. And I wanted to take them and bring them into a context where people could relate to them in the present, especially young people. Isn't necessarily going to say that, I want to go read that old thing. But if I could give a story where that was relevant in a future, like tech society in Silicon Valley, which is around here, I thought that would be a good way to bring that message through. And so I had that idea, but I couldn't get any traction on it. There was something missing.
Like when you
And
say you couldn't get any traction on it, was it like internal traction, like in terms of getting the story out of you, or another kind of traction?
It was traction in the concept, in the sense that I immediately saw the setting, I saw all the characters, how to, and I had the concept, though, was I was going to take individual, it was going to be short stories. I was going to take individual stories that you could call them like fables from that script, from the ancient scripture, and each one would have a parallel in the present. That concept didn't work somehow. That was what I couldn't get the traction on. And then the election in 2016 rolled around, and about a week after that, um, I was on a plane, and I was not happy with the results of that election. And I had this insight that what I had with that book was I had the ancient story and I had the future story, but I was missing what we were experiencing in the present. And the instant I saw that was missing, the whole thing, whoosh, it just in a matter of almost minutes came together. And then I started writing and went through it writing it quite quickly and quite easily.
Right. So, if the election had come out differently, you might not have this book.
That is entirely possible. I mean, I don't know that. We can't say.
Yeah.
And I'm not glad that it came out the way that it did. If it gave me the book, if that would have been the only reason for the book. But yeah, it's kind of hard that's a good question in a sense. I mean, it's also possible that something else besides that election result could have triggered me seeing that missing link, because the missing link really was, the present, our present circumstances. So yeah, something else could have ticked that.
To me, that just kind of highlights like this dynamic that I've seen, or this reality that I've experienced when we perceive like negative things happening. You just gave out one example, but there could be a other example as well. A health scare or something. Oftentimes they do lead to things that are positive, right? So it's almost like there's this notion that this thing has happened to us, but in reality, maybe it's happened for us. And it's like almost a beautiful way of coping with something that has happened, is what art might have come from that, which is kind of, I'm hearing a little bit of that from you anyway.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I would even maybe take it a step further. There isn't an official genre called activist fiction. And I don't even know if that's the best term for it, but I have used that book and other people have used it for this book. And I think if you go back to where I was saying that, if I'm working on other people's books, why am I not working on mine? The reason I really wanted to work on mine was the sense of having something to say and feeling that a lot of books that I worked on, I mean, some of them people didn't have any, I mean, they maybe had to write the book for one reason, perish, publisher perish or some other reason, but they didn't necessarily have something that they really felt or it was something where they're working through their own trauma or something, and they wanted, as you're saying, something good to come out of the troubles that they've had. But what I wasn't seeing as much was people saying, I need to write this because something in the world, I need to make this response to something that's happening in the world so that the world can kind of move it, even in my small, tiny, minute little way, can help move the world forward.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know, I mean, I can just throw in there not the second book, but the third book that will be coming out in July is actually a book of fiction short stories, kind of like that original, idea I had for short stories, but totally different. That's about gun violence. So that really does what you're saying.
Yeah. So just going back to the first one, to die. So 2016 now like the engine, the engine's going, right? You've got the idea, the stars are aligning. How long between when you started really fleshing that out to when you felt like you had a finished product?
Yeah, this is what I've always told author clients, and it seems to work for me too, is that I can write a book, or a book can be written in or within a year. Taking longer usually is something else. So in this case, that was true of it was written within a year, but then it was like, how do you actually get this book out to other people?
Yeah.
And
And
that took some time.
and it how did you figure that out? Was it going through the querying process and not finding an agent? In terms of like why it took a little bit longer for the first one, because I'm getting the sense that books number 2 and 3, since you've already got some publication dates, um, might have been born a bit quicker.
Well, yes and no. So, in answer to the first one, having worked as an editor, and as I mentioned, having run a small publishing company, I knew all of what is involved in promotions and self-publishing. And so I knew that was not something for me. I knew it, I just knew it was more than I could wanted to, or maybe ultimately wanted to do, or, just not my style of how I would spend my time. And so I was looking for a traditional publisher at that point. And I did, and through an agent, because with fiction, you need to do that. And I did initially get a little one or two sort of nibbles, and then it just went dead. And so I had to kind of look at what was going on with that. And I mean, I think some of it was the topic, that the publishing industry was saying, well, if you're writing something political, we are looking for something escapist right around now because, real life is too difficult and challenging, and we don't want more of that. So I'm sort of making fun of it, but actually I did get responses that told me that specifically. And then I also, because I know, knew enough people in the industry to just sort of get a sense, and this idea that there really is an age of authors that is, what publishers are looking for. And I'm not in that age group. And you've probably heard this a million times, the social media platform. I mean, I have some of that, but I don't have your, 10,000 or million or whatever TikTok followers. And I'm not about to get them either. So I was up against those realities that I could see. And I actually, at one point in between, 2017 and whatever we were, when I finally went ahead with the publishing, a few years, I actually put it away. I just said, this is going nowhere. And I told a friend that, I had it in the permanent drawer, and she was like, no, that this book, it's got to see the light of day. And at that point I said, oh, well, I have one other option, and that's hybrid publishing.
So when you landed on hybrid as the model, I'm curious, what was it like working with the publisher? Did they provide you with editorial services? Now I know you're an accomplished editor, but I imagine it's always good to have another pair of eyes for objectivity. Go through it. What was it
Yeah.
like working with the hybrid publisher?
So each company is different. The my publisher is She Writes Press, and Spark Press is two imprints of the same under the same umbrella. And I have both with the different books, but they offer the editing they offer is more like proofreading. And so since I'm editing my own book myself, the proofreading is, coming in really handy at the end, but it's not the same. So if I didn't have my own editing ability, I would have to get that somewhere.
Sure, sure. In other words, they're not doing a big content edit for you. It's really just sort of the making sure everything's spelled right and all that stuff.
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, I think, yeah, that's a fair assessment of it. Yeah.
So I'm curious, what can you share with us about the actual story of the die?
Okay. So the story it is set in Silicon Valley, as I mentioned, and there are some characters who are working in a gaming company in the future, and not a clear year, but a little ways off in the future. And they start to see that some things are going wrong. And the beginning of the book, that there's some data that went missing, and then there's some other sort of monkey business with stuff. And without giving too many spoilers, they chase these down and then discover that in fact they all link together, all of huge plot. And I should mention, I guess, that in Silicon Valley in this future, California is its own country, and the rest of what we know as the states is under a dictatorship. And so again, without giving too many spoilers, but you would know this from just the back cover, I think, that the dictator in the dictatorship is threatening. And so what they're discovering are hints of how that's going to threaten them.
Where does the sort of the element of bringing in some of those sacred texts that you were mentioning earlier come into play?
Yeah, so and I purposely didn't include them in giving the introduction to the book there, because one of the things that I really played around with and one felt was important is that the book stand alone, so that nobody would go read it, say, well, stop on page 1 and go, well, this, I can't follow this because I don't know what this is relating to. So in that way, it does completely stand alone. At the same time, well, essentially everything, all like there are layers and layers of parallels. The characters in my book match up to the characters there. And if you know those characters, then you can, match up all of these qualities and see that, and the different plot lines. There's a whole parallelism going on there. The one way that it is evident, though, so you wouldn't know if you don't know that, you presumably would, as a reader, wouldn't miss it. But if you do know it, there's this richness. The one way that it is clear is that there are epigrams at the beginning of each chapter that are quotes. And I went back and forth at different points about whether or not to include them. And in the end, I'm glad that I did, because they are little hints that, they're not, you could read them and say, well, I don't see quite how that relates, but I don't have to do anything about it. Or you could see it and see, oh, I see how that relates, and leave it at that. Or you could, read them and say, wow, I want to find out where that came, and it could start you in looking at what's the source of, of the quotes there. So yeah, I tried to sort of cover all of that in a welcoming way.
Well, very good. So in other words, you don't need to be necessarily an ancient
Not
text
at all.
scholar to understand the story, but there's maybe some Easter eggs in there for those who are a little bit more familiar with those sacred texts.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it. Got it. So now having gotten this one out there, it seems like, and in my research anyway, the book has won some awards. How important was winning those awards to you? Did it, do you consider that to be important?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I do as a writer, because I don't know if this is true of others, but it's probably true of some besides me, which is, there is that element of, well, I can feel good about this book, but does anybody else care or think it's worth anything? And I actually wasn't super optimistic about that necessarily. And so I applied to a whole bunch of awards thinking, well, if I apply to a whole bunch, maybe I'd get one. And then to my shock, all except I think one of the ones that I applied to, I won. And actually won most of them as opposed to finalists. So that way, I think confirmation is the word that comes to mind. It was very confirming. It doesn't necessarily translate into sales, but there's the hope that it could. But yes, it is that sort of pat on the back that as a writer, because you're working on your own all this time, and then it's like, oh yes, okay, somebody got it. So it's a good
Well,
feeling in that respect.
well, now you can refer to yourself as an award-winning author. So
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
we all need we all need a little validation every now and then.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Yeah.
So having gotten this first one out, now I know that the number two and number three are kind of on the way. It sounds like number two is coming out very soon. What did you learn from the experience of going through the die that you were able to bring into this the follow-up?
Well, here's where I said before, a little bit yes and a little bit no. So the follow-up, and the reason I wouldn't necessarily recommend to anyone to publish 2 books in 1 year. But the reason it happened is that that's a book I actually wrote in 1995. And so, I didn't, in a sense, learn anything because it was done before, and it was more that I was happy with the publishing process and feeling like, wow, this is so good. I don't want to. Originally, I thought, I'll wait till the die is out, how it all goes. Then a few months after that, maybe I'll decide. And so early on, I was like, no, this is really what I've been looking for. Why wait? So, I put it in the queue and went ahead with it in that respect. And that's also why it's very, like I said, it's about the past. It's a historical fiction. So it's about the past. It's totally unrelated. And, I mean, did I learn? I mean, I've learned about the publishing process from this perspective as an author, that things that I didn't know as either an editor or a publisher, what it's like to do some of this stuff on your own. So I have learned that. Yeah. But now I'm working, and then the next one, as you said, is coming out. That was more of, okay, I learned sort of thing of like I could write this in a year, that works. And I'm actually working on a sequel to The Die right now.
All right. So it seems like you've got your hands full. There's a lot of like a creative eruption happening inside you, Jude.
Yeah, right. It's all those years I waited listening to other people's books.
That's
Um,
right. Well,
some of that is true, I think. But
yeah.
also what I'm saying about that sense of, if you feel you have something that is worth saying, then why not take the effort, whatever, pursue it and say it.
Along those lines, what words of advice might you have for an inspiring author who is kind of going through kind of what you were thinking about years ago, which is, hey, I've got a story inside me, I need to get it out. What would you advise them in terms of how to go through the writing process and then how to go through, getting out into the world?
Right. And this is my day job. That's what I do. Right. And it's different for different people, what I say to people. But when you're saying that, the first thing that comes to mind, which is one thing that I say to people, to aspiring authors, and as you're saying, is that if you're a writer, you will write, and and you should write, and you can divorce that from publishing. And maybe I'm saying that partly because I was it wasn't terrible that I didn't publish before. I mean, it isn't that everything you write has to be published. And a lot of people who come to me as authors to an editor maybe have some work that is worth writing, but not necessarily needing to be published. And so I do a lot of that with people, helping them figure that out. Because if somebody says, well, if I'm not going to be published, then it's not worth writing this, then I would say it's not worth writing it. If that's your only goal. I mean, unless it's something we're talking about, something they have to do for a job, but I don't think we're talking about that here. And the other thing that's changed in how I relate to authors is I used to just work with their work as they come to me. And now I preface everything with asking them what their goals are. Because what their goals are determines how I'll edit their work, which was not true before.
Mm-hmm. What's an example of that?
Well, even an example of their goals?
Yeah, like how you might do something, work with them differently based on different goals.
Right. Yeah, so I'll give you an example. This isn't fiction, but and this is a composite client because there's many of them, but it's a typical story where they come and they want to be published by a traditional publisher, and that's really important to them. And ask them about their goals, and they don't move off that goal. They don't say, oh, well, yeah, that's one thing, but I'd be just as good self-publishing it. So they say, well, I want to publish with a traditional publisher. And then I say, okay, if we edit your book to, be able to approach an agent or a traditional publisher, we're going to have to do all of these things. Whereas if you're going to self-publish, which maybe they're saying isn't, like a very distant alternative possibility if they've exhausted the other. So we're going to end up with two books, because what you can self-publish isn't going to look like what you need to have for the traditional publisher. And that's especially because the authors usually have in mind, all kinds of things about how they want their book to be in the first place. So I'm having to force their book to really conform and have its best chance of success with a traditional publisher, and put them through all of those hoops, none of which they'd have to do, or not none of, but few of which they wouldn't have to do with the other routes. So that's an example. And then they go, okay, well, then you have a choice as an author. You could either say, okay, well, maybe I don't need to go for that, or they maybe say, well, I'll go this one whole route and end up with two books, and I'm okay with that. But it's those questions never arose, 10 years ago.
Yeah. And I imagine even if they do go traditional, there's no guarantee that the traditional publisher won't want to have things rewritten or, re-edited based on their own, what they're looking for.
Oh, yes, although I would say most traditional publishers, in my experience these days, if the book doesn't walk in the door looking pretty close to what they already want, they're just going to say no.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough. If you could go back in time and whisper some words of advice into your younger self's ear, what would you tell a younger Jude?
That's a good question. I mean, the temptation is to say that I should have, gotten on with this a little sooner and published the book sooner. But in reality, that's a temptation, but I don't think it's actually sort of valid advice, in the sense, well, two things. One is, things happen when they're ready to happen. But beyond that, and this is, I don't know how you'll think of this, but even though publishing is really, really centered on getting young writers careers and, get a maximum number of books out of them and all this and that, I don't feel that I could have written well, I mean, I obviously wrote The Vow, which is the second one in 95, but I mean, I wasn't a teenager at that point. And I rewrote it a couple times after that. So my sense is that, at least for me, that what I bring to the table as a writer now, I couldn't have brought when I was, in my 20s or 30s, for sure. For sure. Not at all. I mean, not even close. And, then it's sort of maybe a gradual thing. And that's why I'm saying, well, maybe I could have done it a bit earlier. But the advice of, go out and do this when you're young, I'm skeptical about how, obviously there are good good writers who are young, but I think the publishing industry has a problem, I guess I should say. That would be one way to put it, with its focus on young people, because in fact, there's a certain amount of life experience and wisdom and whatnot that goes into writing a book that you don't have when you're young.
Yeah. And I love that notion of the stories will come when they're ready. And that maybe you couldn't have written, a story like To Die, 20, 30 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. True. Yeah. And I mean, it's also, that's true in the larger scope of the concept of the book, but it's also true on a line by line, sentence by sentence level.
Yeah.
What you bring to write it, to write a sentence.
Yeah. Dude, I'm sure we've sparked some interest from some people in our audience. So I'm curious if people want to reach out to you and learn more about you. Do you have a website, or do you have any social media you might be active on to share?
Sure. Well, I definitely have a website. It's judeberman.com. And yeah, I'm also on social media, Facebook, mainly Facebook. I have a Facebook author page, but Instagram, I have a link tree. Shows all of them.
I'll be sure to put those links in our show notes so people can find you easily. And Jude, I will say thank you for stopping by Uncorking a Story and letting me uncork yours.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlon uncork a new story.